How can it be accelerated and made clear in a clearer way for ourselves that what we perceive and experience is a projection of the ego and not something that exists independently of our mental contents?
In a simple word, practice of, in a few words, by the practice of self-investigation and self-surrender. That is the only way we will get the clarity to understand this. Intellectually, we can understand, but we have no evidence that anything we perceive exists independent of our perception of it. That by a little bit of deep thinking, it's relatively easy to understand. We have no way of knowing. We know that while we're dreaming, the dream seems to exist the dream world seems to exist independent of our perception of it. That's what we assume while we're dreaming. When we wake up, we recognize immediately that it was just our own, it was just a dream. It was just our own mental projection. So since we have no evidence that we are not now dreaming, because whatever we now experience, we could equally well experience in a dream. So there's no way of knowing that we're not now dreaming. So from a purely, if we just set aside Bhagavan's teachings for a while and just think about it, we have no evidence that anything exists independent of our perception of it. We may believe that things exist independent of our perception of it, but we've no evidence that that is the case. And if we, philosophically, we should always try to look for the simplest explanation. In science, they follow a philosophical principle, which is popularly called Occam's razor, which is for which the more technical term is the principle of parsimony. That is, you should always try to look for the simplest explanation. For any set of phenomena, they can be explained in many different ways, but the favored explanation is always the simplest one. And it's even expressed even more precisely. The explanation that assumes the minimum number of entities. So if we assume that the world exists, that anything exists independent of our perception of it, then once we get a very complex world, we get a world exists there. I am a separate observer. The world exists independent of me, and all you get to complexity. Then you have all the science and the history. All these things may be true then, but if you accept that this is all a dream, that's extremely simple. Because in a dream, what do you have? You have only one. You've got a dreaming mind, and that dreaming mind has projected the world and sees that world as if it's other than itself. But what is actually existing there is only the perceiver and its perception, the ego and phenomena, subject and object. So that's an extremely simple, ontologically, to put it in philosophical terms, ontologically, a dream state is extremely simple. What we consider to be the waking state, if we are right in considering that the waking state is something other than a dream, it becomes ontologically very complex. So it is going against the principles of Occam's razor to assume that this is anything but a dream, because saying it's all a dream is the simplest explanation. But that's just an explanation from the rational point of view. Even though we reason, yes, I've got no evidence that anything exists independent of myself, still it seems to me that all these things exist independent. And because I've got a desire and attachment for all these things, I don't want it all to be just a dream. I want it to be all real and everything. So our own likes and dislikes come into play a lot in deciding. If we study the history of philosophy, East and West, there have been so many different views people have had. And every philosopher will have arguments to support his views, his or her views. So, but though philosophers may be very good at justifying their beliefs, finding good arguments, why they believe what they believe, ultimately It is not, because there are equally good arguments to justify other beliefs. Ultimately, people believe what they want to believe, whether they're philosophers or whether they're just uneducated people, or religious people or scientific people. Everyone believes what they want to believe. So we use our reasoning to justify what we've already decided we want to believe. So, but if there's most of the things we believe, we make many assumptions, unjustified assumptions. So if we want to, Descartes, the French philosopher Descartes, he started off with a very good method. He didn't actually apply his method properly, but he said, in order to arrive at the truth, I'm paraphrasing, this isn't exactly how he put it, but he said, in order to arrive at certainty, I have to reject everything that is uncertain. So anything I believe but I cannot be sure about, I should assume that it's not true. In order to get down to the very, what actually can we be sure about? And eventually he came to a conclusion, I think, therefore I am. But even that is, he hasn't simplified it enough, because we know that we are whether we think or not. We don't need to think in order to know that we are. Bhagavan said, to say, I think, therefore I am, is like saying, if an elephant walks down the street, saying, no, I don't believe an elephant walked down the street until you see the footprints. Ah, I see the footprints. Yes, and now I believe the elephant has walked down the street. Just a minute before it was walking in front of you. Why do you need to see its footprints to believe it? So I am is shining always, whether we are thinking or not. In sleep, we're aware that we exist. I am is shining in sleep without any thought. So why do we need to first think in order to know? It's true. We couldn't think if we didn't exist. But we don't need to think in order to know that we exist. But anyway, that's a slight digression. The method, philosophical method, but Descartes proposed is a very good method. If we reject everything that we cannot be sure about, we ultimately come back to there's only one thing I know. I exist and I'm aware. I'm also aware of the appearance of many other things, but I can't be sure that any of those other things actually exist, because they could be just an illusion. But in order to, whether what I perceive is true, real or illusory, I must exist in order to perceive it. So there must be, so the I is the base reality. We can come to that by reasoning. And
so,
once we come to understand that, rather than making research on anything other than ourselves, because everything other than ourselves could be an illusion, why to waste our time investigating it? Let's first investigate what is certain, namely ourselves. We may not be what we seem to be, but we definitely exist. Because if we didn't exist, we couldn't be aware. So we've got evidence to, it's very clear, but we are not what we seem to be, because now we seem to be this body, but a little bit of reasoning, if this body were actually ourselves, we couldn't be aware of ourselves without being this body, being aware of this body. But in dream, we're not aware of this body. We're aware of some other body as if it were ourselves. So this body cannot be ourselves. Likewise with the mind. If this mind were actually what we actually are, we couldn't be aware of ourselves without being aware of the mind. We're aware of mind in waking and in dream, but in sleep there's no mind. But we're aware I slept. So we're aware of our existence in sleep, even though the mind didn't exist there. So we are not any phenomenon. We are not anything that appears and disappears. We are what is ever present. That is the background awareness, the fundamental awareness of our own existence, I am, that alone is real. That we can understand. So once we've understood that, what should we do? Though we understand that we cannot be this body, we still seem to be this body. So we need to get rid of this illusory awareness, I am this body. How can we get rid of this wrong awareness that I am this body? Only by being aware of ourselves as we actually are. And in order to be aware of ourselves as we actually are, we need to not look at other things. nowadays in neuroscientists and so many others, neuroscientists and philosophers, are studying consciousness. But they're studying consciousness as if it's a phenomenon, as if it's something other than themselves. If you want to study consciousness, consciousness needs to turn back and face itself alone. Because
so, Michael,
in science, when you want to study something, you first have to isolate it. You've got to remove all other variables so that you're studying only one thing. If for example, if you've got a herb, but you know has some medicinal properties, you first separate all the ingredients and test each one of them. Then you find which is the active ingredient. So we need to isolate awareness or consciousness from all the all the phenomena that we are conscious of. And when we isolate awareness by turning our attention back towards ourselves, we are awareness. By being aware of ourselves alone, we isolate ourselves from everything else. Then we know what we actually. Then we have a chance of knowing what we actually are.